Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrice Mason, and I'm the current president of the Human Services Club. In conjunction with the Clothesline Project, presently taking place in the East Building in room 115, we have 3 distinguished guests to share their experience, their strength, and hope, and insight about domestic violence. I am here to introduce Mayor Christine Forgy. Hey, Forgy, former graduate of GCC, Russell Bradbury Carlin, okay, Director of MOVE, Men Overcoming Violence Program of Amherst, and Amelia from Nelquit, an outreach counselor with 25 years in human services. 25 years experience, correct? Okay. Each of our guests will speak on a topic pertaining to domestic violence for approximately 10 minutes, followed by a question-answer period. So without further ado, please help me offer a warm welcome to our guest. Here's Mayor Forgy.
Good afternoon. Is this on?
Yes.
Yep. I'm too close, or is that good? Everybody can hear me okay? I'll just raise my voice. I'm very pleased to be with everyone here today. I thank you very much for the generous invitation to participate in something that, for me as mayor, has taken on a life of its own and become a pretty integral part of what my administration is about. Before the government changed, the last thing that the outgoing council did was they passed a resolution declaring Greenfield a domestic violence-free zone. In doing that, I think they set a tone for me, and certainly for fellow counselors that would come after. It was kind of a charge. Pick up this gauntlet and run with it. Do something significant with it for the community. A resolution is a wonderful thing, but it's a piece of paper. And so how do we take the words on a piece of paper and really implement them and make them part of our community and part of our daily lives? So that responsibility fell to me. As a result of that, I implemented a mayor's task force for a violence-free Greenfield. And we have had, I have to say, overwhelming response from people in the participation. Our committee, our task force, technically runs between 40 and 50 members, all representatives from different social service agencies, members of the public, survivors of domestic violence, law enforcement, educators, people who work within government to implement policy. And that's really what this committee is about. It's about public policy, and it's about putting the power and the privilege of government behind important issue and try to make Greenfield as safe as we can as in a community for as many people as we possibly can. As I said, the response was overwhelming. I had no problem getting people to participate on the panel. And what we've done is we've talked about the issues of domestic violence. We've had people come forward and talk about the manifestations of domestic violence, how they see them, how they survive them, how they deal with them within their professions and within their personal lives. As a result of that, and we talked to people, we actually had representatives from the city of Cambridge come in, talk to us how they implemented a very successful domestic violence-free city for themselves, how they were struggling to get some things up and running, and gave us suggestions on how we go ahead and we do things. This community there are so many people that are aware, and yet there are so many people that are not aware of what domestic violence is. There's also a culture in our country that seems to accept domestic violence as a norm. And as mayor of Greenfield, I'm here to say that it is not acceptable, and our community demands much more from its citizens in regard to its behavior and in regard to the tone that we set in our community and really the modeling we do for our fellow citizens and for students, youth, children that are going to come after us. We have now moved, the committee itself, the task force has now moved into subcommittees, and each subcommittee is charged with a specific area. Mine, and that's the one I'm going to talk about right now, is the legal task force, the legal subcommittee of the task force. What we're doing is we're looking at ways in which we, as a committee, can make recommendations back out to the group for implementation by myself or the council or our justices, our court system, any agency that's willing to participate and partner with us, so we can talk about some of the issues that revolve around the process when domestic violence happens. One of the key members of this is our police chief, David Gilbo, and he has been very instrumental in bringing to light the fact that the justice system, the legal system, just does not work fast enough for victims of domestic violence and abuse. And one of the things that we are looking at is trying to think about ways in which we can be effective partners with the justice system. Although there's a resistance sometime in legal professions to, they need to stand alone. They need to be autonomous and not to be influenced in order to make appropriate non-biased decisions. We are actually looking at a number of ways that we could bring about some change. One of the things that we've started talking about is trying to model a program that exists right now in Franklin County called Drug Court. Now, this is not to say that these issues are similar. They may have overlap. They do have overlap. But we're looking at ways in which we can move things forward, we can bring in earlier intervention, we can actually grab people that are in a first-time situation and try to bring social service agencies at that point, at the beginning of something that started to happen, rather than wait until you're in an adversarial position and you go back to the court systems and it's just one thing after another after another. I know from what Chief Gilbo tells me and others have told me that a woman is most vulnerable at the time that she decides to leave a partnership, a relationship, or a marriage. And the courts don't really move fast enough. Everybody's sitting around, everybody's separated, everybody's thinking about things, emotions and processes are escalating. And this is some of the things that we want to try to curtail in some way, make that break, and put in place something that will help to make that break or make it more obvious to the courts that we need quicker intervention and quicker action by the courts. Another thing that we're talking about, which is, I think, an essential piece for not just only this legal subcommittee, but for the community as well, as the education piece. Oftentimes, we don't reach out to the youth in our community, to the children in our community, at important levels, at beginning levels in our community, to start to talk about issues of respect, issues of ways solving differences, mediation pieces, all of the things that we can ingrain upon our youth and our young people, that this is not acceptable forms of behavior, and we can try to redirect some of that behavior. We don't have resources. I'm not telling anybody here anything they haven't heard before. We don't have enough resources sometimes to throw toward these types of issues, which really are root causes of a lot of the things that we go through in our community. I know that of all the police calls that are answered in Greenfield, 19% of them, 19 to 20% of them are domestic violence calls. And of those 19 to 20%, more than half of them are significant violence has happened in those calls. I think about the resources that we use right now when we're doing the crisis management piece, and I'm hoping that someday, and we are a long way from that day, that we in Greenfield will be able to use those resources towards education and not towards the intervention in the crisis management. Some of the things that we talked about when we talk about educating at different levels, a very significant piece of this is to not only start on the younger levels, but to reinforce what our preteens and our teens are learning as they start to socialize with each other, and how we want to convey messages to them how we want to really point to consequences as well. People have been told you shouldn't or you should, it's okay or it's not. But what we want to do is get more information out so they can make decisions themselves. They can make good decisions and they can be guided toward those decisions. For instance, it was pointed out to me in this legal subcommittee, the work we were doing, that oftentimes people don't understand the consequences of their actions. They don't think ahead enough to know that if they participate in domestic violence, then there are going to be certain jobs, certain areas that they're never going to be allowed to pursue. If you're convicted of domestic violence, you're not going to be allowed to go into the military. You're not going to be allowed to be a police officer. You're not going to be allowed to do other things with security within your government. There are going to be certain avenues of professions that'll be shut off to you. We want to get that information out. We want to have kids start thinking about this, particularly in the high school range, as they start to think about careers as well. Start focusing on, let's open those dialogues. Do you know you could not get this kind of a job if you do X, Y, and Z? I don't think anybody's ever said that. I don't think everybody's ever really brought that message to people that what they do now will impact them later. The choices they make now will be very significant to their future and adult life. My time is up, and panels are always difficult because if you talk too much, then nobody else gets a chance to talk at all. But I have to say, we're just the right size. I've been on panels where there's been 8 of us, and the last one gets 1 minute. So that's a little bit of what we're doing in Greenfield right now with this, with the task force that's here. We are an energized group of people. As we grow, our reputation grows as well, and we are starting to encompass more and more people from varying backgrounds. And we actually have had very recently, and this is a significant piece for me, we've had representation come forward from a coalition of fathers that are struggling with issues of child custody. And in some way, they see that as directly related to the whole issue of domestic violence, and also related to a lot of the social service agencies that serve the victims of domestic violence. They came in a bit strong, I have to say, and after they were here, some of our people on the task force started to receive inappropriate email and other things. I put a stop to that right now. People are welcome to come in if it's in the spirit of conversation and if it's in the spirit of moving the issues forward. But if it's just a platform to complain, this is not the appropriate place to do it. We want to be as inclusive as possible. We want to recognize that there is domestic violence that exists between same-sex couples and from female to male. But we also want to deliver the message that in order to solve this problem, it's going to take the cooperation of all of us. You have to leave the personal agendas at the door, and we have to really work together to identify what it is we want to do and have for our community. I've given everybody at their place the guiding principles that were developed for the task force. And if you have any further questions or want any information, I'm available by email. My number is 772-1560. You just give a call. The Domestic Task Force is meeting tomorrow afternoon at GCTV downtown, I believe, and we are meeting at 3 o'clock. And we meet once monthly. And we'd enjoy having your participation, even if you just like to sit in and listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Russell?
Thanks, sir. And you have a good internal clock. I need my cell phone, so I won't be sitting here 45 minutes later and going, oh, 10 minutes went by. Way more than 10 minutes. Again, my name is Russell Bradbury Carlin. I'm the director of the Men Overcoming Violence program. I'm not going to talk a lot about my program, but what I will say is that we're a state-certified batterers intervention program, and we run groups in Hamden, Hampshire, and Franklin County. In fact, we run a group right down at the end of the road here. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to respond fairly directly to 4 sets of questions that were posed to me for this panel. So the first question that was posed to me was, how do you see domestic violence affecting the community at large? Actually, each of these questions could easily have an hour response, but I'll try to give you I've got little notes, so I got a little thumbnail to respond to. I think one of the ways that domestic violence affects the community at large, actually before I get to the effect, I think one of the effects on the effect is how we look at domestic violence. I think commonly people who haven't really thought about it too much, or even people who are involved in it, have not really understood that domestic violence is much more than the stereotype of the big burly guy who just got out of jail, who is telling his wife directly that you do this or that, or I'm going to kill you. I mean, that happens. But at least in my experience, the work that we do with people who are first-time offenders and so forth, that's like 1%. Most of the people we deal with are using all other kinds of issues that are really about power and control. They don't necessarily look like everyday violence. Sometimes it is. It's name-calling. It's threatening behavior. There's a lot of fear going on. But really, what's underneath all that is this need to maintain power and control in the relationship, and that's done by controlling the money, saying who you can and cannot see, checking phone logs to see if you're calling someone. There's a lot of things, and I think that's the first step, because if you start to really define domestic violence as all those things, then I guarantee you that everybody in this room, and probably everybody in Franklin County, knows someone, is themselves a victim, knows someone who's a victim, or has someone in their family who's a victim. So it does affect everybody if you start to see it that way. The second question was, what improvements would I recommend to reduce the incidence of and impact on domestic violence? I would go back to my first response, and I would say a greater understanding amongst the community about exactly what domestic violence is. There's a lot of discussion and sometimes tension even amongst people who know this stuff, between anger management and domestic violence, and they're actually quite different, though domestic violence looks like anger, and sometimes anger is the tool to enact domestic violence. But let me give you a quick thumbnail of how I see it different, because it comes up a lot with men who come into my program. They say, I don't really need this program, which is 40 weeks long, once a week, group for 2 hours, as opposed to an anger management program, which often runs like 12 weeks, 15 weeks. So often there's the tension around money and time, so they say, I have an anger management problem. If I can take care of that, I won't need to come to your to the MOVE program. And what I'll say to them is, I'll say, well, when you're at work and your boss gives you an inappropriate task, let's say, that isn't part of your job description, or he's had a bad day and he chews you out for some reason, do you threaten to kill him? Do you take a swing at him? Do you call him names? And sometimes they'll say yes, that's true, but most of the time they actually don't. Okay, then, well, if you truly had an inability to control your anger, then it would show up all over the place. It would be like road rage, you would be screaming at people on the phone, it would be, you'd be losing jobs. But it's not, because there's some mechanism, and sometimes I don't think it's very conscious, that there's a difference. They know that their boss has power over them. Again, power and control. They hit their boss, they lose their job. They know, or they feel they have some permission to be able to enact that power and control in their house. So there is a distinct difference. So I think the community needs to understand the issue a lot deeper. I think that the various parts of the systems that deal with domestic violence, I think we all need to have common understanding about what different parts do. So there's like victim services, there's batteries intervention, there's criminal justice, and there's actually a lot of parts to the system, but those are kind of the main ones. And I think there's been a lot that's happened actually over the last few years, particularly amongst victim services and batteries intervention services. I think years ago it used to be a little bit more like victim services were holding on to money because they don't have a lot, and all of a sudden batteries intervention comes in and they were looking for funds and so forth, and there was this tension around like, who are these people? They're taking money from victims, and then slowly we've been able to kind of like work together and not pull from each other's pie, and to also understand how we can work well together. And I think that's happening less, but more so with the criminal justice system has been my experience. But I think we all need to really define our terms the same and try to work more closely. And the last, I think, is the community needs to learn how to confront perpetrators and to support victims. I think there's a lot of support for victims, maybe not as much as there could be, but I do know that that there's often a response of like, it's none of my business, and it still happens these days. I mean, I think if someone saw someone grabbing their wife and throwing them down on the lawn, someone would, call the police or something like that. But would they if they heard loud voices calling out from behind a closed door and hearing a woman calling out in fear? Would they call? If they saw a guy pushing his wife to get on the bus or something like that, with a little more force or something like that, would you respond somehow? I think that what would be great is if there was more peer pressure in our community, that it wasn't acceptable, that when something like that happens, someone would even just give a cross look or make some type of comment. I actually think that would reduce a lot of incident, because when that doesn't happen, when someone is out in the downtown Greenfield and they yell at their wife to get in the car, you stupid bee, and no one says anything, everybody who's seen that situation didn't say anything has basically condoned it, because that person's feeling like no one said anything. On some level, that's okay. And I also think that men need to kind of step up in this issue. This is not I count 3 men besides myself in the audience. This isn't an uncommon ratio for me when I do these type of talks. I very rarely see men in the room, or I see very few men in the room. And I think that's an issue. The third question was, what human service resources do you feel are most helpful or most effective to address the problem of domestic violence? Batter's intervention, victim services, I think, and the criminal justice system, meaning the police, the courts, and probation. I think those are the crucial parts. And I think we're doing a lot, again, as I was saying, I think we're doing a lot better working together. There are a lot of other parts that need to start to connect, and I think the task force, a mayor kind of stepping forward around this issue is relatively unique and new. I think that's huge. And kind of bringing in all these other kind of secondary players, like the visitation centers, mental health centers, drug and alcohol abuse centers, and they also can play a role in this too. I also, just to say a little bit more about that, I also feel like the people who are kind of in the core also need to do some better work around understanding some of the grayer areas of this work. For instance, I know the MOVE program needs to do a better job in reaching out to and being a resource for gay and lesbian batterers. We actually get very few that come to our door, and I know that there's some reasons that are on our end for that reason. I do think the issues that are brought up by the fathers' rights groups do have some validity. My experience is that 99%, and this isn't just some stat that I've read somewhere, my experience is that 99% of the perpetrators are men, heterosexual men that we work with. That there may be a lot of reasons for that, and there may be more female heterosexual perpetrators out there than the 1% that we see, but that doesn't mean we should ignore it. And I actually think this work is getting a little more complicated around those issues. And I think it really behooves all these players to really start to understand that and not just kind of put it aside. And I think that's starting to happen. There's a lot more thought put into it. But again, my experience is that a lot of the violence from a victim, this is where we need to get clear with our terms, is that a lot of violence from a victim is often the response to years and years of violence being contained and finally erupting in one moment. Or an anger management problem. It's not domestic violence. It's maybe this partner does have a problem with their anger and would, be better served by an anger management program, not a batter's intervention program. And finally, the last question I was asked was, how do you see the roles of human service and criminal justice organizations working together? I've talked about that. I guess the only thing I would say that I haven't already said is that the reality is that, at least in our 3 counties where we work, the criminal justice system does not follow the letter of the law. The letter of the law these days are that if someone is arrested for a domestic assault and battery for the first time, they're supposed to go to a state-certified batter's intervention program. Someone has a 209 restraining order, relatively new law. If it's broken, they need to go to a certified batter's intervention program. It doesn't happen nearly as much as it should. I don't have any statistics in front of me, but it's shamefully low. And there's I wish I brought it with me. There's statistics around how many domestic violence arrests have gone on in Greenfield, and then we did a tally of how many Greenfield clients we've had, and it was like 100 to 1, 10 to 1 rather. That's a problem, and there's a lot of reasons for that. This isn't the place for me to list those, so there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell.
Amelia.
My name's Amelia. I work with NELQUIT, and basically, I'm pretty shy at talking to large groups, but I can definitely talk. So I'd appreciate it if you could probably put the timer on me also. So instead of me being distracted by looking at his cell phone, right? So anyway, it is very interesting, the questions that you posed, and I started really thinking it a part of the whole, not only how domestic violence affects the victims that we work with, but also the community at large. There was one of the questions that was posed, how do you see domestic violence affecting the community? Okay? I started thinking about that, and it really, once I started putting them in my thoughts, I realized there's a tremendous impact on the community at large. For one, the hospitalizations have increased as a result of that, and taxpayers paying for a lot of medical services, especially for indigent populations or poor populations of insurance, people with having problems getting insurance, because there's a tremendous amount of population that does not have insurance. Hospitalizations are up as a result of domestic violence, not only in terms of the physical injuries, but in terms of stress-related medical conditions that's associated with domestic violence, among them being high blood pressure, headaches, the gastrointestinal problems, things like that that result out of stress mostly. Sexually transmitted diseases, a whole range of problems that come out of that. In addition to that, we have a lot of drug and substance abuse problems that result as an impact of domestic violence, because a lot of people try to self-medicate in terms of learning how to cope with the trauma that they're experiencing. A lot of dissociative disorders, anxiety, depression, PTSD, panic attacks, things like that you see a lot in the community. And it has a tremendous effect on not only the victims, but the taxpayers as well. Court involvement. I wrote down a couple of statistics, right? There's 18,000 murders that were attributed to intimates, okay, in 1996. Nearly 75% of them were women. But interestingly enough, right, in Massachusetts, during that same time frame, 25% of murder victims was somebody who got caught up in the crossfire. When I saw those statistics, I'm like, wow, and when you think about it, it's not only the intimate family members or spouses or people that involve friends of the victims, it's other individuals who are innocent bystanders who get caught up in domestic violence. So they also talked about 80% of women who were stalked, okay, by former partners are physically assaulted by their partner. 30% are sexually assaulted, okay? Another effect of domestic violence is there's incarceration of the caregivers and sometimes the children in families who experience domestic violence. Homelessness is another problem that comes out of that. More than half the homeless school-aged children, 57% witness domestic violence in their communities. This came from a MSPCC risk factor fact sheet. Poverty is another thing that you see as a result of domestic violence because of the fact there's so much trauma in families. A lot of people are forced to relocate, and so they don't necessarily have the financial means. Some of them have to give up their jobs. Some of them have to give up, everything they've come to know, their homes, et cetera, in order to get away from someone who's perpetrating violence against them. Oftentimes, it's not a matter of just removing the perpetrator of the violence, because oftentimes people violate restraining orders, they'll come back, and there's more violence, people in imminent fear and threat of their lives. So there's relocation costs associated with that, lost wages, therapy bills, all kinds of things that come out of that, not to mention the physical injuries, emotional injuries that you have to deal with. So a lot of times people move to substandard housing, they have problems, they leave and they go to shelters. They really have a difficult time, and I think that's some of the things that we see, especially in NELQUIT. We have people that are in the shelters that are in that situation. They have limited time frames because, like you were saying, the funding is minimalized, unfortunately. But there are a lot of other services now that are put in place that assist, in providing funding and resources for people. It never used to be that way. I think Russ was talking about people trying to make more collaborative efforts now in terms of sharing funding and resources because, the government and other funding sources that we've had, in the past have really reduced the process. So you see more collaborative efforts, which is a really, really good thing to see. I'm really pleased that the mayor took the initiative to establish this task force because not only does it make us collaborate more in terms of trying to resolve situations of domestic violence, but also, like you said, to share those resources is extremely important, right? Child abuse is another thing that we see, right? 30 to 60% of the children from households with domestic violence are victims of violence. So, of course, that brings them into the situation where a lot of them get involved with DSS. That in terms is also putting strain and stress on funding, in terms of taxpayer dollars going to resources that can provide for people who are displaced or who are experiencing, traumatic injuries, right? There's environmental risks that go with that, because like I said, people go into inadequate housing. You have problems with truancy at school, poor attendance at school, kids getting moved from system to system. We have people in our shelters that, within the last few months have moved like 5 times, in order to escape their batterers. And like I said, it puts a lot of strain on the populations that we serve, and also the agencies, because like I said, the funding sources are limited, and you definitely want to help and get them in secure, stable housing. And unfortunately, the funding is not there. You get a lot of acting out behaviors. DSS takes custody of a lot of these children that are involved in the situation, so you get additional costs, not only with the hospitalizations, but residential placement, shelter placement, field adoptions, so on and so forth. And like I say, the statistics here, also in terms of homelessness, more than half the homeless school-age children, okay, like I said, witness violence. The risk of abuse is 20 times greater, 20 times more greater for children living in families with annual incomes below $15,000. You can only imagine the stress and the, just moving from place to place and the instability a lot of families experience, because they have strong survival skills. They want to go someplace where, they can live as normal life as possible and then learn to deal and cope with some of the trauma that they've experienced. And so that's one thing I want to say. They had another question, which was, what improvements do you recommend to reduce the incidences of impact of domestic violence? I think Russ kind of hit on it also. I think socially that we have to learn how to dealing with children in terms of dealing with issues of gender inequality, rigid sex roles to help reduce violence. Because one of the things we see, especially with people who batter, men who batter, that although there's a huge percentage of the gay lesbian population, which is like probably 30% of their population who batter also, one thing that we see a lot is a lot of rigid sex roles. They really hang on to stereotypes of what a man and a woman's role should be in life, right? One of them is, the man should be tough and control, so on and so forth. A lot of people, like you say, have limited coping skills. They use physical power, verbal and emotional abuse to gain control of the individuals that they deal with. It's reinforced by the media, advertising, and the culture in general. A lot of people are reluctant to get help because culturally, especially, members of third world populations, they're reluctant to bring police involvement into their community, and then also religious cultures also, the role of the wife is to stay with her man no matter what, as long as he financially provides with, for you, then, you take whatever he dishes out, basically, and you keep the family unit together. So, a lot of times if someone tries to break away, culturally they're induced to go back to the situation. Lack of family supports, a lot of things that, in terms of keeping a person healthy, financial, considerations also, because a lot of women may be forced to work, especially if they hang on to traditional roles within the family. The man works, and the woman is submissive, passive, and takes care of the household and the children, So to reduce that, I think we'll probably have an impact on domestic violence, right? Institutionally, we talked a lot about sharing resources and collaboratives and so on and so forth. And I was recently at a training at DSS, and we were talking about wraparound services, because I don't know if anybody knows, but Athol Orange area has a patch office, and the patch office uses this wraparound model of services, which is very unusual for a DSS organization, but I used to work on a family stabilization team, and I know it works extremely well, because what you have is service providers come in and discuss one case unilaterally amongst each other. And so you take a team approach to try to establish, the problems with the family, the planning for that family, what resources you want to share to try to help support the family. But it's also very unusual because it's client-led. So the clients, in that particular family, it's individualistic, with each family. They determine what their goals should be. They know their shortcomings most of the time. There are people with cognitive disabilities that, sort of in a gray area, but basically they know what they need, so on and so forth. And the clients lead and determine where they want to go. They identify their strengths, they identify their weaknesses, and agencies will come around and support them on the weaknesses. If there's someone who needs childcare because they want to go into like a GED program, the agencies will get together and collaborate, so it's not like everybody doesn't know what the other person's doing. There's different expectations. There's a lot of confusion because when the DSS writes their service plans and so on, I've seen as much as 71 counts of services that the client is expected to fulfill. And like I say, people have limited cognitive abilities. When you have 71 counts, it's very overwhelming. And you're working with other service providers. It's very, very difficult to engage. They asked also, what human service resources do you feel are most helpful and what's most effective to address the problems of domestic violence? I think the MEAS task force is tremendously helpful because, like I said, we have a collaboration of agencies. And I think before we used to be individualistic in our approaches and exclude people like MOVE, so on and so forth. Now we're incorporating them into trying to resolve the problems. And we're talking a lot about how exactly we're going to do that. There's a lot of times, like in this particular forum, that we're together or working together on this issue. Another thing is a Jane Doe organization. It's a Massachusetts Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence, right? This organization will do safety planning with you. They have statewide shelter lists, so anybody can call if they're in fear of their life. They connect, with shelters throughout the state, and they will establish a link for you to get from one point to the other. They have Massachusetts Victims of Compensation Program, which is an excellent program, I think, in terms of trying to provide funding, because we talk about lack of funding, but they provide funding, and what they do is get criminal offenders money from funds and fines and stuff that they have to pay, and utilize that to help the victims. They provide as much as $25,000 in paid on the case, and they provide services for mental health counseling, medical bills, therapy, funeral costs, anything that might be associated with domestic violence. Okay.
We have to have first periods. Thank you so much.
Feel free to ask any of the panelists a question.
I believe that there is. I believe it's a lot goes undisclosed. I believe that part of the issue that has been brought to the forefront now by the Fathers Coalition coming forward is it gets back into the roles, expect gender roles. And I think that in our community, I think there is a lot that simmers under the surface, not necessarily always in regard to domestic violence, but I do think there's lots of things in our community that we tend to look the other way on, and domestic violence is one of them.
I like that idea because I think for someone, again, most of the time, if you take like every incident of domestic violence that happens, probably most of it isn't illegal. The illegal is threatening to kill someone or actually hitting someone. And again, like I was saying, there's all this other stuff that goes on. And, I talk a lot, when I talk about this, I talk a lot about the need for people to kind of, the peer pressure thing. But what do you do? How do you act if you see someone who you don't know doing something? What do? Do you go up and talk to them? You know what I mean? Like, you might put your own life at risk. It would be great if there was a DSS type entity that someone could call and say, I have a concern for this family, and someone would kind of move in, take a look, and move out if there's nothing, or move further in if they were. Though DSS has its own limitations, but the idea, the model, I think, is a good one. I like it.
Well, I think a lot of people don't report, like you said. I can't guess at an estimate, but I know it's pretty significant. I'm going to say at least 30%. Don't quote me on that, but that's my own estimation. Of cases that don't get reported, a lot of times, like I said, there's a cultural boundaries. People don't want to invite police presence in their communities. There's a lot of fear, shame, guilt. People who, like I said, they lack the social supports, and it puts them in an intimate risk because half of the cases, like, who are reported to DSS and other organizations are actually screened out. So what if there's an investigator that's present and perhaps, that investigator is charmed to think that really nothing is going on where there actually might be, that family might be more at risk a lot of times. And that's unfortunate, but like I'm saying, with the limitations of DSS, they only have like 10 days to investigate. And generally, they try to talk to providers, like school systems, et cetera, to determine if there's child abuse. And a lot of times, the child will cover up because they don't want to bring that type of pressure or retaliation from an abuser onto their family. So, like I say, a lot of them, unfortunately, get screened out.
It was interesting as we started to discuss from a legal point of view what we can do and what we can't do and what's important for us to really focus on where we can make a significant change. A lot of people right now are first responders and they're also mandated reporters. It's interesting if you work for municipal government, however, that there was some fear expressed by people that said, if I do my job and I do my job correctly, and it happens to be some highly visible political person in the community, who's going to protect me and what's going to protect me from that political fallout? So one of the things that I intend to do is implement a policy in Greenfield and maybe even have it go into contractual language that talks about first responders, mandatory reporters will not on any administrative level receive any kind of punitive action for their response, regardless of who they are reporting against. I mean, think about that, and that's very telling in moving you away from the stereotypical scenario that was talked about by Russ into the whole idea that, yeah, does this permeate our society? Is it in our community? Is it with people that we know and respect? Is it with leaders? The fact of the matter is it exists everywhere. And we need to put more things in place so we can support the people that really want to find a solution to the problem. So that's a first step. The legislative ordinance bylaw step would be the councils. But they took the first step with the resolution. Maybe we can, as a result of this committee, push them more towards bylaw language. Well, that's interesting that you bring that up, and not to jump ahead of the other speakers here. But the task force actually went ahead. We had a banner, and we had the banner strung across the main street, and we said that domestic violence was not accepted in Greenfield. And we had it done in a number of languages, and I want to say a lot, but we had a number of calls from people who said, "Oh, this is just." Not true. The language was used a little bit differently. This is not true. It exists. I'm a victim of it. You're not doing anything. And of course, you try to work with people to get them into the right channels where they could be helped. But the fact of the matter was that I think it was so shocking for people to see us say as a community that domestic violence is not acceptable in this community. We're not going to tolerate it here. As a first step, it was very shocking. And they're saying, but you haven't done away with it. And we're saying, but yes, this is the goal. This is what we hope someday we will be able to achieve. In the meantime, work with us and let us help you and let us keep trying to bring this to fruition. So I agree 100%. 100%.
Excuse me. I would also like to say, the mayor was talking about first responders, and it came to mind, with first responders and the importance of collaborative efforts I was talking about before. One of the things, we have a domestic violence intervention project, and there were only certain police departments that are involved with that. Unfortunately, I think that's one of the limitations with that project, and hoping to incorporate more police departments, but also to make the first responders aware of some of the situations. I had situations in the hill towns where there was incidents of domestic violence, dealing with weapons and ammunition and so on, and had to call the police department 3 times to get them to respond. Finally got the woman to the police station, and, you know, we had arranged shelter, so on and so forth. Not Nelquit, I want to disassociate from Nelquit because this was with another agency that I work with. And basically, you know, when the police went and intervened and had the woman at the police station, the kids were there for a long time. It took a while for services to be connected because when I placed her in the shelter, she didn't tell me that there were people she knew around that shelter, so I had to get another location. And ultimately what happened was the police department sent her home with a bruiser. She was raped and she had all her ribs broken on her left side, so on. It was tremendously upsetting. And when I called the police department back to say, you know, why did you send her home? I told you in 15 minutes I would have another shelter for you. He seemed like a nice guy. But then he had a 6-page felony rap sheet, you know? So I'm like, no. So, you know, a lot of times you really have to address with the first responders. They represent the general population just like everybody else. And there are people who believe and who don't, you know, and there's a lot of issues as how much they internalize the stereotyping and gender roles. Happily to say there is an agency like that. It's the DA's office, and you can speak to Kathy Alexander. And I think it's everybody's responsibility to try to activate people that you might know of, like Kathy, to come out and talk to people in the schools and work with teachers in terms of learning how to deal with violence that they witness in the playground or in certain families that they're working with.
Yeah, I definitely agree that to work with young children on many things about how to, you know, talk about if they witness something, but also about breaking down rigid gender stereotypes. And also, I think the other thing that kind of contributes to this is the way that we define power in our culture. And this shows up everywhere. I mean, basically the way that we define power is the need to have power over. It's all about having more money, being the tougher one, being the winner. And that's not the only way to define power. I don't think even people think about that. And my experience in doing this work for about 20 years is that there's been a swing. When I first started it, you know, the media was definitely kind of forcing those gender roles and the issue of power. I saw it kind of like wane and kind of be pulled apart. And now I see it just snapping back into place again. And I mean, everything seems to be about like winning, not really about coalition building or talking to people, communicating. It's about like, you do me wrong, I'm going to do you wrong. That's a basic message that we're giving children. They're going to combine that with rigid gender stereotypes. There's battering right there.
But there's also another element of that, and this comes forward when you start to talk about youth in the community, and that's another task force that I have as a youth task force. We have to, as adults, be good listeners as well. We have to be keyed into what people are actually trying to tell us. And not that we should all sit there and analyze and interpret and everything else, but, you know, what do Americans say? Hi, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, great, and you walk away. Now, somebody from another culture, well, why did you ask me that question? Same thing with a child. How are you today? Are you going to sit and listen to what that child has to say, or are you just going to say, great, I'm glad, you know, and walk away? So it really is, again, as you point out, and the complexities are monumental, but it's really not, again, the stereotype piece. It's a whole community that's really going to have to surround this issue and work towards a resolution on it. Absolutely. I can't speak to what is exactly in place right now. I only know what we've been talking about doing and talking about implementing. And part of what we need funding in order to do it, number one. But I think that the police department and the coalition agencies, we will be putting some programs in place. And I know that Chief Gilbo, we're very fortunate to have him, by the way, really believes in the early prevention intervention piece. When we talk about the DARE program, it's not early enough. When we talk about behaviors and modification to behaviors, it's not early enough. So it needs to really be a K or pre-K through 12, gradual, you know, sort of a core curriculum. They teach by core curriculum in some schools. That probably needs to be a core curriculum piece that you address at every level as you go along, and I can see where that can happen, so.
And I definitely agree with you. And I'm feeling it about, kids talk and they're telling you what's going on and stuff. And it's in our culture for some reason to just say, okay, we're taking care of it.
Yep.
Oh, it's done. And that's not what's happening for my children in our schools here. They're talking about it and they need something done, and there needs to be some curriculum, some education.
Unfortunately, our time is up.